Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm back today with a video of a different kind. Instead of breaking down the factions in Total War Rise of Mordor like I usually do, I'm going to be discussing the more minor changes in the mod as a result of its most recent major update, such as unit design changes and added units to faction rosters, giving my opinions on the changes, rather than just redoing faction reviews I've already done. That doesn't mean I won't be redoing faction videos for the mod in the future, it just means I won't be doing them in this current video. With that point made, we'll turn to the first faction to have major changes made to its roster, Dol Guldur. Physically, the orcs and all the factions have had their height increased, still being smaller than men but being closer to their size now, rather than being quite a lot shorter, this change also being evident in the Dol Guldur roster. As I said, that height change has impacted all Orc and Uruk units in the mod, so keep that in mind, although the Uruk-hai haven't had their sizes changed, given that they're already the same height as men. Moving on from the height change, we come to the Champions of Dol Guldur, one of the faction's potential generals and its heaviest, most elite shock infantry units, who has been visually redesigned. Before the most recent update, most of the orcs in the unit, if not all, were outfitted the same as the unit officer, having two skulls stuck on wooden spikes attached to their backs. Now, these two skulls have been removed from everyone except the officer. In terms of my thoughts on the unit, I think with the skulls removed, they more easily fit the dark armoured aesthetic of the faction, fitting in more easily with the greater bulk of the armies of Dol Guldur while still looking intimidating. Also, the officer now looks far more unique than he did before, with only really his helmet differentiating him from his troops. Now he has the skulls to help set him apart. Moving on to a different unit, the Guldur Pikes have also been slightly redesigned, being equipped now with a greater range of pikes. Before the update, all the orcs in the unit were using the exact same pike model, the one with the oversized head resembling a khopesh, with a massive curved blade. Now, while that type of pike is still used by the majority of orcs in the unit, there's a bit of range with what weapons they have, with some in the unit having these more rectangular / diamond shaped pike heads, being shaped to have gaps in the blade to allow it to trap enemy weapons. While my same critique for almost every pike seen in the mod as a whole applies here, that pike heads should be as small as possible as was done in real life, rather than having massive blades on the end, this pike variant nevertheless looks cool, and gives the unit some variety which is nice, given that while the orcs of Dol Guldur have somewhat standardized under the leadership of Azog the Defiler and Bolg, they are orcs at the end of the day, and that limits how standardized they can be, especially compared to the more advanced civilizations of men such as the Gondorians. These are some of the more minor changes the faction has experienced. However, the faction has changed greatly in regards to its general lineup, which has also had an impact on how many units the faction can field at certain times. Added to the potential general units for Dol Guldur is Khamul of the Nazgul and his Black Easterlings retinue. Khamul is the second in command of the Nazgul, being the direct subordinate of the Witch King of Angmar and also one of the few named Nazgul in Tolkien's Legendarium, known to have been a great and powerful Easterling king in the Second Age, before being corrupted by Sauron's rings, coming to be known as the Shadow of the East and the Black Easterling. As the second in command of the Nazgul, Khamul was placed in charge of the fortress of Dol Guldur and stationed there as its lieutenant during the final years of the Third Age, before being dispatched to capture the One Ring and fighting in the War of the Ring in the south, preventing him from defending Dol Guldur from Galadriel, before his spirit was destroyed when the One Ring was. As a nod to his Easterling heritage, Khamul commands an elite group of them, while his position of commander of Dol Guldur in universe makes him an excellent choice as a general for the faction. Breaking down the unit's equipment, we'll start with its officer, Khamul. For a helmet, he has one that is somewhat in the style of the typical Easterling helmet, which in terms of real life very much looks to be inspired by ancient Greek Corinthian helmets, especially with the long cheek guards and face opening, although stylized of course with its spikes to give it an evil appearance. The helmet also has a ridge above the brow, which helps stiffen the helmet and provides another surface for enemy weapons to bounce off of. Finally, and most visible of all, are the two large ram horns attached to the top of the helmet, giving Khamul a demonic appearance. Horns on helmets are a bit of a contentious topic, as while it is true that peoples like the Vikings didn't have horns on their helmets, and that European knights tended to enter battle with helmets unadorned with horns, there's almost always evidence to the contrary suggesting that warriors in history did enter battle with helmets with horns. such as some depictions of knights of the Teutonic Order fighting with horned helmets, and the enigmatic sea peoples of the Bronze Age collapse who were depicted in contemporary art as warriors with horned helmets. That said, going into battle with massive ram horns attached to your helmet is something that there's no evidence of, so I have to say that the horns are historically implausible, although they do look awesome and help differentiate Khamûl from the other Nazgul. Moving to the rest of his outfit, he has the appearance that he has in the Battle of the Five Armies Hobbit film, wearing black robes and armour that give him shape, given that his real body crumbled away millennia ago. Protecting his upper arms, he wears oversized overlaid spiked armour that also serves as pauldrons, resembling somewhat the bud of a flower in appearance, only in grim metal. Protecting his forearms, he has the same style of armour operating as a vambrace, while his hands are protected by highly articulated gauntlets that wouldn't look out of place in the 15th and 16th centuries, while his feet are covered in sabatons of the same style. For a weapon, he wields a ludicrously oversized multi-flanged mace, with a long studded haft for easier grasping, and a spiked end that looks like the car window breaker on a keychain. While flanged maces are very much a historical weapon, maces at this size are definitely not. Maces on shafts that are long are known, for example being used on horseback by Mongols to run down infantry, so a long mace isn't inaccurate. It's the extremely thick shaft and head that makes it inaccurate. While I'd say that haft being made of metal is ahistorical, metal hafts for maces were known, and with a head that large and heavy, you'd need it to be made of metal because a wooden one wouldn't be strong enough and would break. A weapon that heavy would be almost impossible to lift at best, and would be impossible to lift at worst, swinging it being completely out of the question in the best case scenario. The weapon resembles the mace of Sauron seen in the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring film, with Sauron using it during the War of the Last Alliance. While Sauron's mace was similarly as massive, it makes sense for it to be so, given that it was wielded by a being who could manifest themselves as a giant armoured warrior, while Khamûl is only the size of a human and uses a similar sized weapon. Although that said, the Nazgul are shown as being supernaturally strong, with the oversized weapon also sharing similarities with the giant flail of the Witch King, perhaps the Nazgul having a tendency for massive weapons due to their intimidation and terror factor, but also as a way of emulating their master. In terms of effectiveness as a weapon, if you had the strength to wield it, no armor in the world would be strong enough to stand against you, so it would be incredibly effective, making sense for such a devastating weapon to be used by the leader of a unit of shock infantry. Moving on from Khamûl and his certainly distinguishing armor and weapon, we come to his retinue of black Easterlings. For head protection, these warriors wear black hoods and veils over which they wear a helmet/mask that only protects the upper half of their face, similar in operation if not really appearance to salays from the 15th and 16th centuries, the helmets having eye slits and an open area for the nose. Attached to the helmet are two structures somewhat like horns or antennae, and these most remind me of the attachment some medieval knights would wear in tournaments and sometimes battle, as well as the horned helmets of the Vexo people of Denmark from the 10th century BC. For body armour, they wear what I can only really describe as a leather coat with a mail hauberk over the top, the hauberk having a rider's split for some reason. While leather and mail being used in combination is known, leather coats aren't really something that were known in the classical or medieval periods, being more of a creation of the modern era, or if you're really pushing it, the early modern era. Protecting their feet, these warriors have sabatons, although the rest of their legs are unarmoured. Above their mail hauberk, they have several layers of overlapping plate providing excellent protection for their torso, although their waist is more vulnerable, while their upper arms appear to have pauldrons and attached plates, with the rest of their arms being undefended except for cloth wrappings. While wrapped cloth has been used for millennia by troops, it was used for comfort and protection from the elements primarily, so these warriors using it to protect their forearms is inaccurate, and really makes the unit look haphazard in its equipment, given that the upper chest of these soldiers is heavily defended, their stomachs and upper legs are well defended, and then their arms are mostly undefended. A really weird look for a unit that's meant to be the elite of the elite fighting alongside a literal Nazgul. Because these guys are shock troops, they lack shields and instead use a cross between a poleaxe and a giant warhammer in the style of Sauron's armour and weapons, being very flanged and wrought of black iron. While two-handed warhammers are known as a rare weapon, they wouldn't have been made completely of metal, nor would they have been as thick as these weapons, which are complete overkill. The striking hammer portion of the weapon is split into 4 pieces somewhat like a mallet, something that can be seen in real warhammers, and directs the force of the blow into those individual points, while atop the weapon is a vicious spike like a spear tip, useful at stabbing enemies in the gaps in their armor and for fighting off horses. Finally, at the back of the weapon is a jagged blade, which looks to be hooked, serving as a weapon with which to pierce enemies and to knock them over or off horseback. Overall, as a weapon, it resembles a very fantasy-inspired interpretation of a warhammer mixed with a poleaxe, and while it looks way too heavy to be feasibly used, especially for regular men unlike the supernaturally powered nazgul, it does make for an intimidating weapon, capable of tearing through armoured enemies. Moving away from their equipment and onto their unit role, Khamul and his black Easterlings are shocked infantry of the heaviest kind, decimating any infantry formation they come into contact with, especially when attacking them from the rear or sides, breaking just about any unit in their path, being a terror to corded out infantry and stuck cavalry. That said, the unit does have weaknesses such as its lack of armor, which means archers are a very effective counter to the men of the unit, or the unit can get bogged down in infantry brawls and eventually overrun. Shock cavalry is also a threat that must be observed when deploying this unit. As a general unit, Khamul and his men are roughly equivalent, if not superior, to the champions of Dol Guldur, who can be generals too. However, I view them as inferior compared to the Servants of the Eye, because their weaknesses are that much more difficult to avoid compared to the Servants of the Eye, who are also vulnerable to archers, but can avoid being sniped unlike the shock generals, which lack the speed to avoid danger. Because of that, I have to rank Khamul as being inferior to the Servants of the Eye, not only due to his unit's inherent weaknesses as shock infantry compared to cavalry, but also because deploying the Servants of the Eye as a general gives you 3 cavalry units to use in your armies when playing as Dol Guldur, as typically it only has 2 Servants of the Eye available to be included in an army, this change meaning that the cavalry strength of the faction is greatly increased, something that is greatly appreciated for a faction starved of heavy cavalry, where you also get a harder hitting and more resilient general. As much as I like Khamul, there is another major change to the Dol Guldur faction to talk about, and that is the Nazgul, leading the Servants of the Eye. This unit is pretty much an alternate art version of the Servants of the Eye, with their commanding officer replaced by one of the unnamed Nazgul, riding a dark horse just as armoured as those ridden by the men in the unit. The Nazgul wears black robes with scalloped plate gauntlets and vambraces for arm protection, while its legs are protected in plate greaves and cuisses, with sabatons for foot protection, although the leg armour is mostly covered by the robes. For a weapon, the Nazgul uses a nice bastard sword that wouldn't look out of place in the 15th and 16th centuries. The warriors in the unit are equipped identically to those in the regular Servants of the Eye unit, with these guys being just as effective heavy cavalry when on the battlefield, being melee cavalry rather than shock. This means of course that they're better in the thick of melee than on the charge, although they can be pretty effective when charging. As a general, these guys have replaced the previous Servants of the Eye, with only one Nazgul unit being capable of being deployed in an army. In effect, all that means is that your general will look unique, and that you'll get access to more heavy cavalry, which is always a plus, meaning that I'd rank this as the best general unit in the faction, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of the options it gives you compared to other generals. With these guys covered, all of the changes to the Dol Guldur faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the next faction with noticeable changes to them. We're going to skip the Easterlings because they're going to get their own video due to just how much they've changed, so the next faction that we can look at and see visible changes in is Eisenguard. Looking at the Mordor rabble, they now have a variety of different faces that they didn't have before, making them look unique rather than just clones, having different coloured skins and hairstyles. This visual variety is also present in the Mordor bow rabble, so it's nice to see, although the ranged orc units in the Dol Guldur faction haven't had any changes to their faces. That said, the main change to see in Eisenguard's roster is the new unit the faction have access to, the first of their spear units, the half-orc spears. These medium spears are equipped the exact same as the Uruk-hai raiders, with combined leather and plate armour and helmets, with a standard Uruk-hai shield, the only difference being their weapons. Instead of a blade, these troops use bladed spears identical to those used by the Dunlending spearmen units, a possible nod to the connection between the two factions, also somewhat resembling the partisan with its blade-like head. As a weapon, this spear would be capable of both slashing and stabbing, although its capacity to do both would be somewhat lessened compared to a sword made for cutting or a spear made specifically to pierce enemies. For a unit officer, the half-orc spears have the standard Uruk-hai commander. As a unit, these guys make the forces of Isengard that much more flexible, providing the faction with the ability to use spears rather than solely rely on pikes like in the past, giving you more varied and cheaper anti-cavalry options, while making your front line that much more resilient. The major weakness of the unit being its lack of armor and small shield, which makes it vulnerable to archers, continuing the tradition of eisenguards anti-cavalry units being susceptible to bowmen. This means that in order for your spear line to be cohesive enough to hold out against the enemy in melee, you must first scatter their archers before they bleed your line of strength. A good unit, which while not amazing compared to other spearmen in the game, has definitely changed the ways in which you play Isengard now. Moving on from Isengard, we come to yet another evil faction that has seen its units change, Mordor. For some of the smaller changes to the faction, the Orc rabble and Bow rabble have had the same changes to their appearance as the Isengard rabble units, now sporting a variety of different faces while similarly having their size changed. The first major change made to the faction is that they have lost a unit in their melee infantry lineup, no longer having access to the Haradrim vassal swordsmen, which I'm sad to see go. The reason for the change probably being that instead of players getting a taste of what was to come when the Haradrim weren't in the mod, now that they are, you can just use them instead of relying on essentially a faction teaser. The Orc Pikes have also been changed, going from being a polearm unit to now being a pike unit, which makes sense given that pikes are quite distinct from other polearms, although I did like the idea that the Orc equivalent of pikes are polearms because of the shorter size of orcs. A major change made to the Mordor faction is that the Servants of the Eye cavalry unit, which used to be a potential general unit, has been changed to now be a nazgul unit, essentially swapping commanding officers and being the same as the nazgul unit in the Dol Guldur roster we looked at before, only one being available for deployment. Because this unit is literally the same as the previous one, I won't repeat myself. However, I will say that when chosen as general, having the Nazgul means that you effectively have 4 units of Servants of the Eye, greatly boosting the strength of Mordor and arguably making it the best choice for general unit. The next unit to be added to the faction is the one that I'd consider the best potential general unit, the Black Riders. This very unique unit only has 9 individuals in it. However, those 9 are all the Nazgul on horseback, their horses and riders all identically equipped to the officer leading the Nazgul Servants of the Eye. As a unit, these troops are melee cavalry rather than shock cavalry, able to absorb more damage at the cost of not being able to deal out quite as much. While they have the smallest number of troops in the game, they aren't vulnerable to being swarmed by enemies like you'd expect, given as a way of representing that the Nazgul were next to impossible to destroy. The Nazgul in the game have incredibly high health and armor stats, meaning they can offset their numerical disadvantage with those strengths and the great amount of damage they can deal out, also being practically impervious to having their morale broken. This means that in terms of stats, they're superior to the Servants of the Eye led by a single Nazgul, which is why I consider them the better choice for general, even if they aren't capable of killing as many enemies as quickly as the Servants of the Eye with their larger unit size. It's for this extra toughness that I consider them a superior choice for general unit, although in reality, all the heavy cavalry general units of Mordor make for good generals. These guys are just edging out the competition when it comes to being able to stay in the fight longer. Finally, the last major change to the Mordor faction is the last general unit available to the faction, and my favourite in appearance, the Witch King of Angmar, leading a unit of Servants of the Eye. The Witch King is the greatest of the Nazgul and the chief lieutenant of Sauron, so it's awesome to see him in the mod. His appearance based off of his depiction in the films. For his steed, the Witch King rides a horse identically armoured to the other Servants of the Eye, with the symbol of Sauron etched into the horse's faceplate. Physically, the Witch King is larger than his men, which is an accurate representation of his size, given he's a bit larger than a human in the films, towering over regular men, although not to the same extent as Sauron. His armour is identical to that of the other Nazgul, although his helmet helps differentiate him, having a giant spiked helmet with cheek guards somewhat reminiscent of a Phrygian helmet just taken to the extreme, while his lower face is completely unarmoured, something Eowyn takes advantage of to destroy him. The massive spike atop his helmet somewhat reminds me of a Pope's mitre, funnily enough, perhaps being based off of it, with the helmets of the men of the Servants of the Eye clearly being inspired by the Witch King's helmet in terms of design, although their helmets are far more functional than his. The Witch King lacks a shield and for a weapon sadly doesn't have access to his enormous flail, due to such a weapon being impossible to implement into the game as being used by a cavalry unit. Instead he wields a black longsword, which I'm pretty sure is modelled off of the one he uses in the films, so it's a nice bit of attention to detail on the modder's part, although I'm not sure if the smaller the castle in comparison to the rest of the blade is historically accurate. As a unit, these guys are pretty much a slightly altered visual swap with the regular Servants of the Eye and the Nazgul Servants of the Eye, so all my points about those units in both combat usage and quality as a general apply here. With the Witch King and his troops looked at, we'll move on to the next faction that has seen changes to it, the Rohirrim, and their recently added new unit, the Yawling Retainers. This unit of swordsmen are a step up from the Sword Thanes in terms of quality, being more heavily armoured than the Sword Thanes. For helmets, the Yawling Retainers utilise a variety of helmets, some being fully crafted of metal while others are a mix of leather and metal, all in the style of the iconic Anglo-Saxon helmet, similar helmets being seen used by other Rohirrim units. The composite leather helmets tend to only have a nasal bar and cheek guards for face protection, while the fully metal helmets look to be gilded with gold, but also have a face bar combined with a nasal bar to give them the iconic metal rings around the eyes. All the helmets have small horse crests atop them, small adornments to helmets being known in history, compared to massive horns which are more dubious. The helmets in general look to be of a level of quality above those of the Sword Thanes, helping to show off this unit's elevated status. For body protection, every man in the unit has a scale hauberk with leather backing, far better protection than the collection of mail shirts and scale shirts that the Sword Thanes use. That said, the hauberks have a rider's split for some reason, which is weird given the unit is infantry only. However, infantry having rider splits is a common sight not only in the mod but in many depictions of medieval warriors, such as in TV shows, movies, video games, etc. So it's understandable that the mod creators would make this very common mistake which is perpetuated everywhere. Apart from that, the scale hauberk looks amazing, with such armour very much being used historically by warriors such as the Saxons, but further abroad by many other cultures. Protecting the legs are plate greaves which are a bit out of time compared to the rest of the unit's equipment, which is based off of armour used in the 10th century. Plate greaves only really becoming popular in the 14th century after having disappeared from use in Europe centuries before. Protecting the shoulders of the men are scale pauldrons, while their forearms are covered in decorated vambraces, such armour becoming more popular in the 13th and 14th centuries. Sadly, the rest of the men's arms are unprotected, meaning they have a serious weakness which for troops armoured this fairly well is really glaring and just begs the enemy to attack the arms. For swords, the Rohirrim generally use weapons in the style of the typical Viking era sword, being capable of stabbing but better at cutting, although these weapons in particular look to be more inspired by transitional weapons gapping the bridge from Viking era swords to the arming swords which they evolved into. What I mean by this is that these weapons have slightly longer and more pointed blades compared to the other Rohirrim swords, or their pommel is slightly more round compared to the other unit swords, or their crossguard is still very much short and provides little in the way of hand protection compared to arming swords with their larger crossguards. Finally, for a shield, these men have the same oval shields as the yawling spearmen, who these men are the sword counterpart to, the shields having the same metal boss in the centre providing extra strength to the shield and protection for the hand, with a metal rim surrounding the shield accurate to the real-life shields that inspired it. The shields are very much in the style of early and late Roman scutum with their oval shape, as well as Celtic shields and the Therios shield commonly used in the Balkans by people such as the Illyrians, Thracians, and Greeks, the Rohirrim shields being decorated with white horses, the symbol of Rohan. The unit officer is the guard of the Golden Hall, wearing a far more ornate helmet with far more gold worked into it, and a far larger and detailed golden horse crest atop it. Protecting his torso, the officer has the same scale hauberk as his men, although some of the scales are gilded to show off his wealth, with a highly decorated plate gorget being very inaccurately placed atop his armour rather than underneath it. His shoulders are covered with plate pauldrons inlaid with decorated leather protecting them, being a step up in quality compared to his unit's scale pauldrons, his forearms having more ornate vambraces too, although his legs funnily enough lack greaves and only have boots. For a shield, he has a large wooden shield covered in painted rawhide, or with just the wood being painted with a golden sunburst, the shield very much resembling the round shields commonly used throughout Europe in the early Middle Ages, most famously by warriors such as the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, although many others use them too. For a weapon, he has an older styled blade which very much looks like the standard Viking era sword compared to his men who use slightly more advanced weapons, perhaps using an older weapon as a way of showing a bond with tradition, especially given all the other non-traditional equipment he uses such as all the plate armor segments used by more advanced cultures historically, although the explanation for that could be because the bonds between Gondor and Rohan grew stronger during the time of Theoden's father, there was some technological inflow into Rohan, with some of its warriors getting more advanced armour from the Gondorians who widely used plate armour. Moving away from the unit and its officers' equipment, we'll go to its role. On the battlefield, these are the best swordsmen you can deploy, being a match for the high-quality sword units fielded by other factions except for maybe the elves and the dwarves, who have exceptional melee units. On the offensive or on the defensive, be it on the open battlefield or in fortifications, these guys will put in an excellent service, being great bulwarks who do very well in the thick of melee, although shock troops can't get the better of them with their excellent armor and shields, meaning they can absorb enemy ranged units' fire fairly well. It's when attacking fortifications that I believe this unit shines, as it gives Rohan players heavier infantry, much needed in a faction that lacks shock infantry, meaning you can rely on these guys to clear out the enemy rather than dismounting Rohirrim cavalry, who are far too valuable and few in number to be wasted capturing castles and cities. I very much recommend recruiting this unit in large numbers and replacing your sword thanes with them in late game armies, although the sword thanes are useful units despite how good the yawling retainers are. As a faction change, these guys were very unexpected, but are very appreciated. The last change we'll look at, and the final change to the Rohan faction, is that the Riders of Rohan unit is no longer spear cavalry, but is now shock cavalry, being middle of the line in terms of quality and being the unit that will make up the bulk of your shock cavalry now. With that said, all of the changes in the mod apart from the Easterlings have been covered. Overall, the update has definitely changed the mod and made it far better, giving it greater depth. If you've loved the new update as much as I have, please like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. As I said, a video about the numerous changes to the Easterlings will be coming out, so look out for that in the future. This is your host Jakov, signing out.